This is the entire history of bread, the food that literally shaped our society. I did a lot of research for the video, so if you listen to me, it would be nice. Anyway, I am Bub, and I make videos like these to help people fall asleep or listen to in the background. And if this video just makes your day slightly better, let me know in the comments. This way, I know it is doing its job. And without a further ado, let's begin the entire history of bread. Picture this. You're a hunter-gatherer living around 14,000 years ago in what's now Jordan. You've spent your whole life moving from place to place, following herds of gazelles and wild cattle, picking berries, digging up tubers, gathering whatever you can find. Your group sets up temporary camps near water sources, stays for a few weeks, then moves on when the food runs out. Then one day, someone in your group notices these wild grasses growing everywhere. The seeds are small, hard, covered in tough husks. Most animals can't eat them, but somebody decides to try anyway. They gather handfuls of these seeds, bring them back to camp, and start pounding them between stones. The husks crack open, the seeds inside break apart into a grainy powder. They mix this powder with water from the nearby stream. It forms a sticky paste. They shape it into a flat cake and place it on the hot stones near the fire. The paste cooks, hardens, becomes something entirely new. That moment, that simple combination of ground seeds, water, and heat changed everything. Back in 2018, archaeologists working at a site called Shubaika 1 in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan found something that completely rewrote our understanding of bread history. They discovered burned breadcrumbs embedded in the remains of ancient fireplaces. Sounds boring, right? Except these breadcrumbs were over 14,000 years old. The site had been occupied by the Natufian people. And here's the thing that made this discovery so wild. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers. They hadn't started farming yet. They didn't plant crops or tend fields. They were still moving around, following food sources, living in temporary settlements. For decades, everyone thought the story went like this. Humans learned to farm first, then they made bread. Bread was supposed to be a consequence of agriculture. But these breadcrumbs proved we had the whole thing backwards. People were making bread 4,000 years before they started farming. 4,000 years. Think about how long that is. That's longer than all of recorded human history, from the ancient Egyptians to today. The researchers who found these crumbs had to use scanning electron microscopy to figure out what they were looking at. Under magnification, they could see tiny gas bubbles trapped in the carbonized material, the kind of bubbles that form when you mix flour and water and the starches start breaking down. They measured the pieces and determined these were thin flatbreads, probably only a few millimeters thick, cooked quickly over high heat. When they analyzed the botanical remains mixed into the dough, they found wild einkorn wheat, barley, and tubers from club rush plants. These people knew what they were doing. This wasn't random experimentation. Some scientists now think this discovery completely flips our understanding of why agriculture started in the first place. The traditional explanation was that humans domesticated wheat and other grains so they could grow more food to support larger populations. But maybe it went the other way. Maybe people liked bread so much that they decided to domesticate the plants that made it possible. Maybe bread came first and farming followed because people wanted a reliable supply of grain for making more bread. The desire for this specific food might have driven one of the biggest technological and social revolutions in human history. But even before those Natufian breadcrumbs, there's evidence of people processing grains for food. In Australia, Archaeologists found grinding stones at Cuddy Springs in New South Wales that are 30,000 years old, and at Lake Mungo in the Willandra Lakes region that might be even older, possibly 60,000 years old. 60,000 years. We're talking about tools used to grind seeds before modern humans even left Africa to spread across the world. So the basic idea of taking hard seeds, smashing them with rocks, turning them into powder that you can eat, that's ancient. That's older than art, older than complex tools, older than almost anything we think of as distinctly human behavior. Around 30,000 years ago, grinding stones start appearing in archaeological sites all over the world. Europe, China, the Levant, North Africa. People in completely different places who had no contact with each other were independently figuring out that if you take these tough grass seeds that grow everywhere, pound them with rocks until they turn into powder, mix that flour with water, you get dough. Cook the dough, and you get something that's filling, portable, and stores better than the original grain. This wasn't one person's invention that spread. This was humanity, across continents, solving the same problem with the same solution. Now let's jump forward to around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, to ancient Egypt. This is where bread stops being just a flatbread cooked on hot rocks and becomes something approaching what we recognize today. The Nile River flooded every year, depositing rich silt across the floodplains, creating perfect conditions for growing grain. The Egyptians had three main types of wheat at their disposal. They had emmer wheat, which was their primary grain, a tough ancient wheat with twin kernels that required special processing to remove the husks. They had barley, which grew even in poorer conditions. And they had a grain called dura, probably a type of sorghum. You can actually see preserved samples of these grains in the British Museum today, sitting in glass cases, thousands of years old, but still recognizable. The Egyptians made the breakthrough that changed bread forever: leavened bread. Here's how it probably happened, and this is really just educated guessing based on how accidental discoveries usually occur in food history. Someone mixed emmer flour with water to make dough. Maybe they were planning to cook it the next morning. Maybe they got distracted. Maybe something came up and they forgot about it. The dough sat out, exposed to the air, for hours or maybe a full day. When they came back, the dough had changed. It had bubbles in it. It was bigger, puffier than it had been. It smelled different, kind of sour, but not necessarily bad. Wild yeast from the air, along with bacteria. Now, most people would probably throw that out. Spoiled food was dangerous, but someone decided to cook it anyway. Maybe because food was too valuable to waste, maybe out of curiosity. And when they cooked this fermented dough, they got bread that was completely different from the flat, dense breads they were used to. It was lighter, with air pockets throughout. It was softer, easier to chew. It tasted better, with more complex flavors from the fermentation. That accident changed bread forever. The Egyptians figured out how to control this process. They realized that if you saved a piece of fermented dough from one batch, you could use it to start the fermentation in the next batch. This is basically sourdough, the oldest form of leavened bread. They didn't know they were cultivating colonies of wild yeast and lactobacillus bacteria. They had no concept of microorganisms. They just knew that if you kept this starter dough alive by feeding it fresh flour and water every few days, you could use it forever, passing it down through generations. Some Egyptian families probably used the same starter for decades, constantly refreshed, but essentially the same living culture their grandparents had used. We know a lot about Egyptian bread because they left us incredible amounts of evidence. There are wooden models from the Middle Kingdom around 4,000 years ago that show entire bakery operations in miniature. You can see models with multiple people kneading dough at long tables, others shaping loaves, ovens being tended. These weren't home kitchens. These were professional bakeries, commercial operations producing bread at scale. Archaeologists found one bakery at a workers' village near the pyramids that could produce 2,000 loaves per day. 2,000. That's industrial scale production using Bronze Age technology. Ancient Egyptian texts and inscriptions mention at least 30 different types of bread, possibly more depending on how you categorize them. 30 distinct varieties. They had breads made with different grains, breads with added ingredients like dates or honey, breads shaped into different forms for different purposes. They baked bread in different containers, conical pots that produced tall cylindrical loaves, flat pans that made round cakes, specialized molds that created specific shapes. They had spiral breads that looked like coiled ropes, breads shaped like animals and human figures for religious offerings, everyday breads for workers, luxury breads for temples and nobles. Tomb paintings showed the entire bread-making process in detail. You can see workers pounding emmer wheat to remove the hulls, grinding the grain on stone querns, sifting the flour through woven screens, kneading dough in large wooden bowls, shaping loaves, tending ovens. One tomb painting shows a guy stirring dough with his feet, using his whole body weight to mix the ingredients. The process was physically exhausting work that required skill, strength, and knowledge passed down through apprenticeship. Bread wasn't just food in Egypt. It was money, it was politics, it was religion. Workers building the pyramids got paid in bread. A standard day's wage was 3 or 4 loaves of bread plus 2 jugs of beer. Taxes were calculated in grain and bread. The whole economy ran on bread. When you see hieroglyphics that show a loaf of bread, that symbol sometimes means bread specifically, but other times it represents food in general or even offerings to the gods. Bread and beer together, those two symbols, meant sustenance, life itself. The quality of bread you ate indicated your social status. High officials and priests ate white bread made from twice-sifted emmer flour, soft and fine. Soldiers and craftsmen ate coarser bread with more bran and sometimes added ingredients like doura. The absolute bottom tier was bread with added sand, not intentionally mixed in, but left there from the grinding process when worn stone from the querns ended up in the flour. Everyone's bread had some stone particles in it, actually, and archaeologists can see the wear on Egyptian mummies' teeth from a lifetime of eating bread that slowly ground down their enamel. One archaeologist named Delwyn Samuel did really cool research in the 1990s examining preserved bread from Egyptian tombs. She used scanning electron microscopy to look at the microstructure of the bread, seeing how the starches had gelatinized, how the air pockets formed, how the grains were processed. She discovered that Egyptians sometimes partially gelatinized their flour by mixing it with boiling water before adding it to the rest of the dough, a technique that Japanese bakers independently discovered thousands of years later when they developed milk bread. She found bread made from malted grain where the wheat had been allowed to sprout before being dried and milled, which would have created sweeter bread with more complex flavors. She even found bread where coriander and other spices had been added to the dough. Recently, in 2019, a team managed to extract and revive yeast from ancient Egyptian pottery. They isolated yeast strains that were probably 4,000 years old, still viable after all that time, just dormant. They used these ancient yeasts to bake bread, and according to the baker, it tasted unlike anything he'd ever made with modern commercial yeast. More earthy and complex, and different in ways that are hard to describe. That's wild to think about. We can taste bread made with the same microorganisms that ancient Egyptian bakers were using 40 centuries ago. The Greeks and Romans took what the Egyptians started and developed it further. By the 5th century before the Common Era, you could walk through Athens or any major Greek city and buy bread from professional bakers. Just like we do now, they had shops, they had regular customers, they had competition between different bakers producing different styles. The profession of baker had become respectable, specialized, organized. The Greeks developed better milling technology. The Olympus mill, also called the hopper rubber, used two rectangular stones that slid against each other. This was way more efficient than the old method of grinding in a circular motion on a flat stone. You could produce larger quantities of flour with less effort, which meant more bread at lower prices. Some large bakeries had multiple mills running at once, powered by slaves or animals walking in circles to turn the grinding stones. One Greek writer named Athenaeus, writing in the 3rd century, compiled this huge work called Dipnosophistae, which translates to something like the dinner table philosophers. In it, he describes 72 different types of bread that were available in the ancient Greek world. 72. He talks about griddle cakes cooked on hot metal plates, honey breads sweetened and enriched with oil, poppy seed breads with mushroom-shaped tops covered in seeds, military breads baked on wooden spits that soldiers could carry, barley breads that were darker and denser, wheat breads that were prized as superior. Different grades of flour created different qualities of bread, and everyone understood the hierarchy. The whitest, finest flour made the best bread. The coarser flour with more bran made cheaper bread for poor people. The Greeks and Romans attached moral significance to bread quality. They believed that refined, sophisticated bread reflected a civilized, advanced society. The ability to produce fine, white bread was a mark of cultural achievement. This idea that white bread equals civilization and refinement would persist for literally thousands of years, only really starting to break down in the late 20th century. In Rome, Greek bakers showed up in the 2nd century before Common Era and revolutionized Roman baking. The Romans had been eating pulse, which was basically grain porridge, and baking simple flatbreads. But when Greek bakers brought their techniques and knowledge, everything changed. The Romans were so impressed that they allowed these foreign bakers to form their own professional association, a collegium. This was unusual. Foreigners didn't normally get that kind of official recognition and protection. But bread was too important not to give these experts special status. The city of Pompeii, which would be buried by Vesuvius in 79 Common Era, gives us the best picture of what Roman bakeries looked like because the volcanic ash preserved everything. Archaeologists have found about 35 bakeries in Pompeii, a city of maybe 12,000 people. That's one bakery for every 300 to 400 residents. In the bakery of Modestus, they found 81 loaves still sitting in the oven where they'd been baking when the volcano erupted. 81 loaves in a single oven, all standardized in size and shape, showing just how much bread was being produced every day. These bakeries weren't small operations. The bakery of Popitius Priscus had 4 large millstones for grinding grain, powered by donkeys or slaves walking in endless circles. It had a mechanical kneading device with wooden paddles that rotated in a basin, mixing dough on a scale that would have been impossible by hand. It had a large brick oven that could bake dozens of loaves at once. The oven sat in its own room with ventilation holes to let out the smoke. There was a sales counter facing the street where customers could buy fresh bread. Some bakeries had their own wells for water, storage rooms for grain, stables for the animals that powered the mills. Roman bread, especially the famous panis quadratus found at Pompeii, had this distinctive shape, round, scored on top into 8 segments like a pie, with string marks around the circumference where the baker had tied the loaf before baking to help it keep its shape. The scoring wasn't just decorative. It made the bread easy to break into portions. You didn't need a knife, you just snapped off a segment. This was practical for street food, for workers eating lunch, for households dividing bread among family members. Roman bakers were powerful people. There's this massive tomb outside Rome built for Marcus Vergilius Eurysaces, a master baker from the 1st century before Common Era. The tomb is huge, decorated with relief sculptures showing the entire bread-making process, from measuring grain to baking to selling. The fact that a baker could afford a tomb that size tells you how profitable and important the profession was. Bakers weren't looked down on as mere tradesmen. They were essential to keeping the city fed, and everyone knew it. The Romans also had this saying, bonum panem fert, which means he gives good bread. When people said this about someone, they meant he was trustworthy, reliable, a good community member. Bakers who gave good bread were respected citizens. Some ran for political office. Some used their wealth and status to influence elections and civic affairs. Bread and political power were intimately connected. A poet named Juvenal, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries, came up with the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. He was criticizing how Roman emperors controlled the population by providing free or cheap bread and putting on entertaining games. Keep the bread flowing, give people spectacles to watch, and they won't rebel even if the government is corrupt and incompetent. Bread had become a tool of social control, a way to prevent unrest. The emperors understood that a hungry population was a dangerous population, so they made sure bread stayed affordable and available. But let's be clear about something. Not everyone in Rome ate fancy raised bread. The wealthy ate white bread made from refined wheat flour, light and fluffy and expensive. The middle classes ate coarser bread with more of the wheat bran left in. The poor ate bread made from barley, which was cheaper but denser and didn't rise as well. The absolute poorest people couldn't afford bread at all and still ate poles, the grain porridge that had been the staple before bakers became common. Social hierarchy was literally baked into what people ate. The Romans had laws regulating bread production. The assize of bread, which would later be adopted and expanded in medieval England, originated in Roman regulations about weights and prices and quality. Bread was too important to leave unregulated. The government needed to make sure bakers weren't cheating customers, weren't adulterating their flour, weren't selling underweight loaves. Inspectors checked bakeries. Weights were standardized. Penalties for violations were harsh. Different types of leavening were used depending on where you were. The most common method was saving a piece of yesterday's dough, the same sourdough technique the Egyptians used. But in areas where beer was popular, especially among the Gauls and people on the Iberian Peninsula, bakers would skim foam from fermenting beer and use that to leaven bread. This made lighter, fluffier bread than regular sourdough. In wine regions, people would mix grape juice with flour and let it ferment or soak wheat bran in wine must, creating different varieties of leavening agents. All of these methods relied on wild yeast and bacteria, but the specific microorganisms varied by region, creating distinct local bread flavors. The Romans also popularized the profession of pister, the specialized baker who did nothing but make bread. Before this, bread making had mostly been done at home, usually by women. But as cities grew larger and denser, with more people living in apartment buildings without ovens, commercial baking became necessary. Professional bakers took over, and bread making shifted from women's domestic work to men's professional craft. This shift would have massive social and economic implications that lasted well into the industrial era. Now we get to the medieval period in Europe. If you lived in medieval England or France or Germany, bread wasn't just food. It was a marker of who you were in society, how much wealth you had, your place in the social order. Rich people ate white bread called wastel or manchet, made from wheat flour that had been sifted multiple times through fine cloth to remove all the bran. This bread was soft, light, expensive. The flour itself cost more because you needed more wheat to produce it since so much was sifted away. Only people with money could afford it. Knights, nobles, clergy. Middle-class people, craftsmen, and prosperous farmers ate cocket bread or household bread. This used wheat flour that wasn't sifted as carefully, so it had more bran, was darker, denser. It was nutritious, filling, cheaper. Poor people ate the darkest, coarsest bread, called black bread or horse bread, made from barley, rye, oats, whatever grain was cheapest and locally available. Sometimes it was mixed grain, taking whatever you could get. This bread was heavy, dark, difficult to chew, but it kept you alive. In times of famine, people mixed in peas, beans, even ground tree bark or sawdust just to bulk up the dough and make more loaves. Making bread in medieval times was seriously complicated if you were a regular person. First, you needed grain. If you were a peasant, maybe you grew your own. Maybe you got paid in grain for your labor. Maybe you bought it at market. Then you had to thresh it, separating the grain from the chaff by beating it with flails and winnowing it in the wind. Then you had to dry it so it wouldn't mold. Then you had to take it to the Lord's mill to be ground into flour. And here's where it gets frustrating. You couldn't just grind your own grain. In the feudal system, the Lord owned the mill, and peasants were required by law to use the Lord's mill and pay a fee for the privilege. This was called milling rights or multure, and trying to grind your grain any other way was illegal. After getting flour, you needed yeast. Most people kept a sourdough starter, feeding it regularly and using it for every batch of bread. If your starter died, you'd have to get some from a neighbor or from the baker or start a new one from scratch, which took days. Then you'd mix your dough, knead it, let it rise. Now comes the hard part, baking. Ovens were huge structures made of brick or stone, required enormous amounts of fuel, took hours to heat up, and were serious fire hazards in wooden or thatched buildings. So, ovens were often built in separate structures, sometimes outside town walls entirely. Rich households might have an oven in an outbuilding on their property, but if you were poor, you used communal ovens. These communal ovens were regulated by feudal law. In France, lords were required to provide a four banal, a communal oven, but peasants were required to use it and pay a fee every time. You couldn't build your own oven. That was illegal, breaking the lord's monopoly on baking. So you take your risen dough to the communal oven, wait your turn, pay your fee, and the oven operator would bake it for you. Sometimes you'd mark your loaves so you could identify which ones were yours when you picked them up later. This system was deeply resented, but there wasn't much you could do about it except obey. Professional bakers, on the other hand, had their own ovens and became part of the guild system pretty early. In London, there's evidence of a bakers' guild existing by 1155. The Worshipful Company of Bakers got official royal charters in 1486, 1569, and 1685, giving them monopoly power over bread production in the city. They're still around today, though now they're basically a charitable organization that does ceremonial stuff. These guilds had incredibly strict rules. Bakers had to use the correct proportions of flour and water. They had to bake at the right temperature for the right amount of time. The bread had to weigh what it was supposed to weigh according to the official assize tables. If you made a loaf lighter than it should be, you were cheating your customers, and that was illegal. The assize of bread, established in England in 1266 during the reign of Henry III, was one of the most successful and long-lasting commercial laws in history. It stayed in force, with various modifications, for over 600 years. The assize worked like this. Bread was sold at a fixed price, but the weight of that bread varied depending on the current price of wheat. When wheat was cheap, your penny bought a heavy loaf. When wheat was expensive, your penny bought a lighter loaf. The relationship was precisely calculated with complex tables that bakers had to follow. For example, when a quarter of wheat, that's 8 bushels, or about 240 liters, sold for 12 pence, a farthing loaf of the finest white bread had to weigh 6 pounds and 16 shillings in the old tower weight system, which translates to about 2.5 kilograms. If wheat prices rose to 18 pence per quarter, the weight of that same farthing loaf dropped proportionally. The assize tables specified exact weights for different types of bread: wastel, simnel, cocket, treat, household, for every possible price of wheat. Bakers were allowed a specific profit margin called the lucrum pistoris, the baker's profit. This included payment for their labor, fuel costs, the value of bran and waste products they could sell separately, and wear on their equipment. It was all precisely calculated to ensure bakers could make a living but couldn't price gouge. Punishments for breaking the assize were severe. For repeated offenses or serious violations, like using sand or chalk or alum to adulterate your flour and make it whiter, punishments got physical. There was the pillory, where you'd be locked in wooden stocks in the town square while people threw rotten food at you. There was the tumbrel or hurdle, where you'd be dragged through the streets on a wooden sled with the offending loaf tied around your neck, everyone watching and mocking you. Your reputation would be destroyed. Your business might never recover. In some places, particularly bad bakers could have their ovens destroyed. Imagine having your entire livelihood, the expensive equipment you'd invested years of savings in, reduced to rubble because you broke the bread laws. This wasn't theoretical. Records show it happened. The authorities took bread regulation seriously because everyone depended on bread, and cheating customers on bread weights was seen as a form of theft that threatened social order. The baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12, comes from this era. Bakers would include an extra loaf when selling a dozen to make absolutely sure they met the weight requirements. Better to give away a bit extra than risk the penalties for coming up short. This practice became so common that baker's dozen entered the language and is still used today, even though nobody remembers why it's 13. The guilds eventually split up based on specialization. By the 14th century, there was a white baker's guild and a brown baker's guild. White bakers made fancy bread for wealthy customers. Brown bakers made everyday bread for common people. These two guilds competed for business and political influence for centuries until they finally merged in 1645. Then, in 1686, they got a new unified charter that they still technically operate under today, though obviously the modern worshipful company of bakers isn't regulating bread prices anymore. Life as a medieval baker was brutal. You woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning, sometimes even earlier. You had to get the oven heated, which meant gathering or buying firewood, loading the oven, getting the fire going, waiting for it to reach baking temperature. Meanwhile, you're kneading yesterday's dough that had been rising overnight, shaping loaves, preparing everything. Kneading large batches of dough was physically exhausting. Your arms, your back, your shoulders, all aching from the repetitive motion and the sheer effort of working heavy, sticky dough. Some bakers did all this themselves with maybe 1 or 2 apprentices. Others had peasant women who would bring them pre-kneaded dough, and the baker would just shape and bake it for a fee. Either way, it was constant physical labor, starting before dawn and going all day. You're covered in flour dust, breathing it in constantly, which wasn't great for your lungs. You're working near a hot oven in a time before effective ventilation, sweating in summer, alternating between the oven's heat and winter cold. The profit margins weren't huge, especially after paying your guild fees and complying with all the regulations. But it was a living, and in a society where most people worked the land, being a specialized tradesman with a shop in town was relatively secure. Bread also served another function in medieval times: plates. They made things called trenchers, which were thick slices of stale bread used as disposable dishes. You'd cut a loaf of bread into thick slabs, let them dry out for a day, then use them as plates at meals. You'd pile your meat, your vegetables, your stew on the bread trencher, and the bread would absorb all the juices and drippings. At the end of the meal, sometimes you'd eat the trencher, especially if it had soaked up good flavors from your food. Other times, especially in wealthy households, the used trenchers would be collected and given to the poor, who were grateful for bread that came pre-soaked in meat, juices, and fat. Eventually, people started making trenchers out of wood instead of bread. Later still, metal and ceramic plates replaced trenchers entirely. But the bread version lasted for centuries because it was practical and because it provided a way for wealthy households to give leftovers to the poor without it seeming like plain charity. Different regions developed distinct bread cultures. In Scotland, oat bread was common because oats grew better in the cool, wet climate. In parts of Germany, rye bread dominated because rye tolerates poor soil and cold weather. In Mediterranean regions, wheat bread was standard because wheat thrived there. These regional differences weren't just about agriculture. They became part of local identity. Your bread said something about where you were from. The importance of bread to medieval society can't be overstated. When bread supplies ran short or prices spiked, riots broke out, governments fell, revolutions started. In France, particularly, bread was so politically charged that shortages could destabilize the entire kingdom. During the French Revolution in the late 1700s, bread shortages and high prices were one of the major grievances that drove people to revolt. The average French person at that time ate around 3 pounds of bread per day. 3 pounds. That's not an exaggeration. Bread was the overwhelming majority of most people's caloric intake. If bread disappeared or became too expensive, people starved. So yeah, bread riots weren't about pickiness or minor inconvenience. They were about survival. Then we get to the Industrial Revolution. Machines enter the picture, and machines change every aspect of making bread in ways that would have been unimaginable to medieval bakers. In England, in the early 1800s, there were these laws called the Corn Laws that put high tariffs on imported grain to protect British wheat farmers. The idea was to keep grain prices high so farmers could profit, but this made bread incredibly expensive for everyone else. For urban workers in the new factory towns, this was devastating. They were earning low wages, working in terrible conditions, and a huge portion of their income went to buying bread just to survive. The situation got so bad that in London, they abolished the standard weights for loaves. Instead of buying a loaf that was guaranteed to weigh a certain amount, this was to prevent price gouging and fraud, but it also shows how desperate and unstable the bread market had become. At the same time, more people were moving from rural areas to cities to work in factories. This meant fewer people growing food and more people needing to buy it. Food production dropped while demand increased. The Corn Laws made everything worse. Eventually, with people literally starving and political pressure mounting, the government repealed the Corn Laws in 1846 and removed duties on imported grain. Suddenly, high-quality wheat from North America became affordable. Cheap grain flooded British markets. Bread prices dropped. White bread, which had been a luxury for centuries, became available to regular people for the first time. The technology for producing flour changed drastically too. Stone grinding produced flour that still had all the parts of the wheat berry mixed together, the endosperm, the bran, the germ, all ground up and combined. Then in the 1860s, Swiss engineers developed the roller mill. These rollers could crack open the wheat berry and separate its components. You could remove the bran and germ and keep just the white endosperm, producing pure white flour easily and efficiently. This changed everything. White flour had always been expensive because producing it required labor-intensive sifting. Sifting flour multiple times through increasingly fine cloth to remove every speck of bran. Only wealthy people could afford that, but roller mills made white flour cheap. Suddenly, everyone could afford the white bread that had been a status symbol for centuries. People loved it. They'd been conditioned for generations to believe that white bread was superior, more refined, more pure. Now they could finally afford it. Of course, white flour has way less nutrition than whole wheat flour. The bran contains fiber. The germ contains vitamins, minerals, healthy fats. Removing them makes flour whiter and finer, but it also removes most of the nutrients. People didn't know or didn't care. They wanted white bread, and that's what they got. Steam power revolutionized milling too. Old mills relied on wind or water to turn the grinding stones. Wind was unreliable. Water required being near a river or stream. Steam power meant you could build a mill anywhere and run it whenever you wanted. Production increased massively. What used to take days now took hours. Flour became cheaper and more available than ever in history. Then came the invention everyone knows about, sliced bread. A guy named Otto Frederick Rohwedder from Davenport, Iowa, was convinced that pre-sliced bread would be a huge hit. He worked on his invention for years. In 1912, he built a prototype of a bread slicing machine, but a fire destroyed his bakery and the machine. Most people would have given up. Rohwedder didn't. He rebuilt his machine and finished it in 1917. But here's the thing. Nobody wanted to buy it. Bakers thought sliced bread would go stale too fast. The increased surface area would dry it out. Customers thought the whole idea was pointless. Why would anyone want to pay extra for bread that's already sliced? You can slice bread at home. It takes like 2 seconds. Rohwedder spent years trying to sell his machine and couldn't find any takers. He kept working on the problem. The solution was wrapping. If you sliced the bread and immediately wrapped it in wax paper, it stayed fresh. The wrapping protected the slices from air. In 1928, the Chillicothe Baking Company in Chillicothe, Missouri, became the first commercial bakery to use Rohedder's machine. They ran a full-page advertisement in the local paper on July 6th, announcing the greatest forward step in the baking industry since bread was wrapped. Within 2 years, sliced bread had taken over. By 1930, 90% of bread sold in American stores came pre-sliced. 90% in just 2 years. That's one of the fastest adoptions of a new food technology in history. Sliced bread was so wildly successful that we still use the phrase "the greatest thing since sliced bread" to describe something amazing. It's been almost 100 years, and we're still using sliced bread as the benchmark for innovation. That tells you something about how much it changed everyday life. Sliced bread created whole industries around it. Toaster manufacturers standardized their products to fit sliced bread dimensions. Before sliced bread, people toasted bread over open flames or in toasting forks. After sliced bread, electric toasters became kitchen essentials. The toast goes in, it pops up when done perfectly browned slices. This wouldn't have been possible without standardized sliced bread. Butter and jam sales increased because people were eating more toast for breakfast. Sandwich culture exploded. Making sandwiches became easier, faster, more consistent. Kids could make their own lunch. Workers could grab a quick sandwich without needing to slice bread first. It was convenience culture starting to take over American life. In 1921, something happened in Indianapolis that would completely transform American bread culture. The Taggart Baking Company started running mysterious advertisements that just said "Wonder" with no other information. For weeks, these ads appeared in newspapers, on billboards, creating curiosity and speculation. People had no idea what wonder meant or what was coming. Then, on May 21st, they revealed Wonderbread. A guy named Elmer Klein, who worked for Taggart, had gone to watch the international balloon race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He saw hundreds of colorful hot air balloons filling the sky, and he thought the sight was wonderful, awe-inspiring. He decided Wonder was the perfect name for their new bread. The packaging with red, yellow, and blue balloons was directly inspired by what he saw that day. Wonderbread started small, just another regional bakery brand. But in 1930, they did something smart. They were one of the first major brands to start selling pre-sliced bread, adopting Rohedder's invention early. The timing was perfect. Americans were urbanizing, moving to cities, working in offices and factories. They wanted convenience. They wanted food that was fast, easy, modern. Wonderbread delivered exactly that. The bread was incredibly soft, almost fluffy, with a fine, uniform texture. It was perfectly white, whiter than any bread most people had seen. It came in identical slices, wrapped in clean wax paper packaging, with a brand name and logo you could trust. It looked scientific, modern, safe. This was the age of industrial progress, when new and technological meant better. There was also a darker reason why factory bread became popular. In the early 20th century, there had been serious outbreaks of food-borne illnesses like cholera, typhus, and typhoid fever. Some of these outbreaks were traced to unsanitary food handling. People became suspicious of small bakeries, especially ones run by recent immigrants who were already viewed with prejudice. There were actual newspaper articles and food safety campaigns warning people about the supposed dangers of bread made in dirty immigrant bakeries. Factory bread made in clean industrial facilities by machines instead of human hands seemed safer. Nobody had touched your bread. As pure, clean, modern, this connected to some really uncomfortable racial and ethnic ideas in early 20th century America. Food writers and social commentators literally wrote that white bread represented civilization and progress, while dark bread was associated with immigrants, poor people, primitive cultures. The whiter your bread, the more civilized you were considered. This wasn't subtle or hidden. People said this openly, wrote it in magazines and books, taught it as fact. There was a practical problem that nobody paid attention to until it became a crisis. White bread, with all the bran and wheat germ removed, had almost no nutritional value beyond calories. It was basically pure starch. As more and more Americans ate white bread as a huge part of their diet, nutritional deficiency, diseases started appearing. Young people weren't getting enough B vitamins. When America entered World War II in 1941, military doctors examining recruits were shocked at how many young men were malnourished, underweight, weak. These were supposedly healthy Americans in their physical prime, but years of eating refined white bread and other processed foods had left them deficient in key nutrients. This was a national security issue. You can't fight a war with malnourished soldiers. The government responded by mandating that white bread had to be enriched, fortified with added vitamins and minerals. Thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, iron. These were all added back into white flour by law. Wonderbread started advertising that it helped build strong bodies 8 ways, later changed to 12 ways. 7 of those ways were the added vitamins and minerals. The 8th way was just energy, meaning calories from carbohydrates, but they presented it like it was another health benefit. This enrichment program actually worked. Cases of beriberi and pellagra, diseases caused by B vitamin deficiencies, dropped dramatically. People got healthier even while still eating mostly white bread. But there's something absurd about removing nutrients during processing and then adding synthetic vitamins back in and calling it progress. During World War II, there was a brief period, about 2 months in early 1943, when the government actually banned sliced bread. The official reason was that the ban would save resources needed for the war effort. Steel that would go into bread slicers was needed for weapons. Wax paper used to wrap sliced bread was needed for military supplies. So sliced bread just disappeared from stores. People were not happy about this. Sliced bread had only been around for about 15 years, but Americans had already become so dependent on it that giving it up felt like a major sacrifice. Housewives wrote angry letters to newspapers complaining about having to slice bread themselves. The ban lasted just 60 days before it was lifted due to public pressure. Turns out, sliced bread had become as American as anything else. By the middle of the 20th century, white bread accounted for about 30% of the average American's diet. 30%. That's not total bread consumption. That's total food consumption. Sandwiches for lunch, toast for breakfast, bread with dinner, bread as snacks. It was everywhere. Wonderbread peaked in the 1970s and 80s. That's multiple loaves for every single person in America. The brand was iconic, ubiquitous, seemingly permanent. But American tastes started changing. In the 1990s and 2000s, people became more health conscious. They started reading nutrition labels, caring about ingredients, questioning processed foods. Whole wheat bread sales increased. Artisan bakeries started opening. People wanted bread that actually tasted like something, bread made with recognizable ingredients. Bread that didn't have 30 items on the ingredient list. Wonderbread sales declined year after year. In 2012, Hostess Brands filed for bankruptcy. Wonderbread disappeared from shelves. For a while, it looked like the brand was dead, a relic of mid-20th century American food culture that wouldn't survive into the 21st century. But then, Flowers Foods bought the brand in 2013 for $360 million. It's still around today, still selling in supermarkets, though current sales are around 55 million loaves per year. That's a fraction of what it used to be, but it's still a lot of bread. There are still people who grew up eating Wonderbread sandwiches and want their kids to have the same experience. People who associate that soft white bread with comfort and nostalgia. In 1961, something happened at a research facility in Chorleywood, England, that would change industrial bread making around the entire world. Scientists at the British Baking Industries Research Association developed a new process for making bread that was faster and cheaper than anything that had come before. They called it the Chorleywood bread process, or CBP. Traditional bread making takes time. You mix flour, water, yeast, and salt. You knead the dough to develop gluten. You let it rise for hours while the yeast ferments the sugars and produces gas. You punch it down, shape it, let it rise again. Then you bake it. From start to finish, traditional bread takes at least 12 to 16 hours, sometimes more if you're doing long fermentation. The Chorleywood process throws most of that out the window. Here's how it works. You take flour, water, yeast, and salt like normal, but then you add vitamin C, which strengthens the gluten. You add fat, which softens the crumb. You add various other additives, emulsifiers, dough conditioners, processing aids. Then you mix everything with incredibly high-speed mixers that work the dough much more intensely than traditional kneading ever could. These mixers use mechanical energy to rapidly develop the gluten structure. Because of this intense mechanical mixing and the added ingredients, you can skip most of the fermentation time. You can go from flour to finished, packaged, sliced bread in about 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours compared to 12 or more with traditional methods. The benefits for large industrial bakeries were obvious. Faster production meant higher output with the same equipment and facilities. You could bake more bread per day, per oven, per square foot of factory space. Lower protein wheat, which is cheaper, could be used because the Chorleywood process works with weaker gluten. You needed more yeast, more salt, and various additives, but those costs were offset by savings elsewhere. The economics worked out strongly in favor of adoption. By 2009, about 80% of bread in the UK was made using the Chorleywood process or variations of it. 80%. The process spread to other countries too, anywhere industrial bread production dominated. Australia, New Zealand, India, parts of Africa, and Asia. It became the default method for mass-producing bread. The downsides? The bread tastes bland. Because fermentation time is so short, the complex flavors that develop during traditional slow fermentation don't appear. The texture is soft, but in an artificial way, bouncy and spongy rather than naturally tender. The bread needs lots of additives to work at all, additives that weren't traditionally used in bread making. Nutritionally, it's not great because the additives and processing don't add nutritional value. Some people claim Chorleywood bread causes digestive problems that traditional bread doesn't. The theory is that the lack of fermentation means certain proteins and carbohydrates don't break down, making them harder to digest. Scientific evidence for this is mixed. Some studies suggest there might be something to it. Others don't find clear connections. But anecdotally, many people report feeling better when they switch from industrial to traditional bread. Critics absolutely hate the Chorleywood process. Campaigns like the Real Bread campaign in the UK fight against industrially made bread and advocate for traditional baking methods. They argue that the Chorleywood process prioritizes profit over quality, speed over flavor, corporate efficiency over human health. They want stricter labeling so consumers know what they're buying. They want support for small bakeries making traditional bread. But here's the thing that complicates the criticism. In the 1960s, when it was developed, many people in Britain still remembered rationing from World War II. Food security was a real concern. Making bread production more efficient meant more people could afford bread, fewer people went hungry. That's not nothing. That counts for something. The debate between industrial bread and artisan bread isn't just about taste or health. It's about values, priorities, what we think food should be. Should food be cheap and accessible to everyone, even if that means lower quality? Or should food be high quality and flavorful, even if that means some people can't afford it? There's no easy answer. Both positions have merit. While industrial bread was taking over the 20th century, something else was quietly happening. People were rediscovering old ways of making bread, traditional methods that had been displaced by commercial yeast and factory production. Small artisan bakeries started opening in the 1980s, making bread the old way, using sourdough starters instead of commercial yeast, letting dough ferment for many hours or even days, baking in brick ovens or wood-fired ovens, selling bread that looked rustic and irregular instead of perfectly uniform. Sourdough has been around forever. It's literally how people made leavened bread before commercial yeast was isolated and sold in packages. The process is simple, but requires patience and attention. You mix flour and water in roughly equal parts and leave it out at room temperature. Wild yeast from the air, along with bacteria, colonize the mixture. After a few days, you have a sourdough starter, a living culture of microorganisms that can leaven bread. You feed this starter regularly, adding fresh flour and water, discarding some of the old mixture to prevent it from growing out of control. The microorganisms eat the starches and sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide gas that makes bread rise, plus various acids that give sourdough its characteristic tangy flavor. As long as you keep feeding your starter, it stays alive indefinitely. Some bakeries have starters that are decades old, generations old, passed down through families, like heirlooms. Every sourdough starter is unique. The specific mix of yeast strains and bacteria species depends on your local environment, the flour you use, the temperature and humidity where you keep it, even the microorganisms on your hands when you handle the starter. Scientists have identified over 50 species of lactic acid bacteria that can live in sourdough starters, mostly from the Lactobacillus genus, though that genus has recently been split up and reorganized into multiple genera like Fructolactobacillus, Lactoplantobacillus, and Levolactobacillus. They've also identified over 20 species of yeast, dominated by Saccharomyces cerevisiae and various Candida species. The most famous sourdough bacterium is Fructolactobacillus sanfrancisensis, formerly called Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis. This species was originally isolated from San Francisco sourdough and was thought to be unique to that region, but research using modern genetic sequencing has shown that it's actually found in sourdough starters all over the world. The whole idea of regional sourdough microbiomes, like the famous San Francisco sourdough, being unique because of Bay Area microorganisms, turns out to be mostly a myth. Geography doesn't determine your sourdough microbiology nearly as much as people thought. What does matter? Whole grain flour has more diverse microorganisms than white flour because the bran and germ carry more microbial hitchhikers. The fermentation temperature matters. Different species thrive at different temperatures. How often you feed your starter matters. How much water you use matters. Every variable selects for certain microorganisms over others. The bacteria in sourdough, primarily lactobacilli, are heterofermentative, meaning they produce multiple compounds during fermentation. They make lactic acid, which gives sourdough its tangy flavor and preserves the bread by lowering the pH. They make acetic acid, which adds sharper, more vinegary notes. They produce carbon dioxide, though not as much as the yeast. They break down proteins into peptides and free amino acids, which makes the bread easier to digest and creates savory flavors. They break down phytic acid, which binds minerals like iron and zinc, making those minerals more available for your body to absorb. They produce various enzymes that modify the dough in complex ways. The yeasts, primarily Saccharomyces species and Candida species, are responsible for most of the rising. They consume sugars and produce carbon dioxide gas and small amounts of alcohol. The carbon dioxide gets trapped in the gluten network, making the dough expand. The alcohol mostly evaporates during baking but contributes to flavor development. But here's where it gets really interesting. The bacteria and yeasts don't just coexist. The bacteria acidify the dough, which inhibits many other microorganisms but doesn't harm the sourdough yeasts, which are acid tolerant. Some bacteria species produce compounds that the yeasts need to grow. Some yeasts produce compounds that feed certain bacteria. It's a symbiotic relationship, a stable ecosystem that maintains itself as long as you keep feeding it flour and water. Recent research using modern genetic sequencing has revealed just how complex these communities are. One study analyzed 500 sourdough starters from across the United States and found that while Lactobacillus bacteria dominated, there were also significant populations of acetic acid bacteria from the Rhodospiralis order. These acetic acid bacteria have a substantial impact on aroma and leavening properties, but had been overlooked in earlier studies that relied on culturing bacteria in labs rather than genetic sequencing. What's wild is that sourdough starters are incredibly stable. Once a community of microorganisms establishes itself in your starter, it tends to persist. You can keep the same starter alive for years, decades, generations. Some bakeries have starters that are over 100 years old. The Boudin Bakery in San Francisco claims their starter dates back to 1849, kept alive through the gold rush, the 1906 earthquake, 2 world wars, everything. Whether that's literally the same continuous culture or whether it's been restarted and rebuilt over time is debatable, but the tradition is real. During the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns in 2020, when everyone was stuck at home and couldn't easily buy bread from stores, sourdough baking exploded in popularity. Commercial yeast sold out everywhere. People couldn't find any in supermarkets for months. But you don't need commercial yeast to make sourdough. You just need flour and water and time. So, people started creating starters from scratch, learning to bake bread at home, sharing tips online. Social media became flooded with sourdough content. People posting pictures of their starters, giving them names, treating them like pets. People sharing photos of their loaves, showing off their scoring patterns, displaying their crumb structures with pride. People troubleshooting problems together. experienced bakers helping beginners figure out why their dough wouldn't rise or their crust wouldn't brown. It became this whole community thing, strangers on the internet helping each other learn an ancient skill. The sourdough boom wasn't just about bread. It was about having control over something during a time when everything felt out of control. It was about connecting with something real and physical when everything else was digital and abstract. It was about learning a skill that produces tangible results. Mix flour and water, wait, and you get bread. In a scary, uncertain period, that predictability and reliability mattered. Scientists got interested too. The Wild Sourdough Project, run by researchers at North Carolina State University, asked people from around the world to create starters from scratch and send in samples for microbiological analysis. They collected data on thousands of starters, analyzing their bacterial and yeast compositions, trying to understand what factors influence starter success or failure. This citizen science project generated massive amounts of data about sourdough ecology that wouldn't have been possible any other way. One thing they discovered is that there's no correct sourdough microbiome. Starters with completely different bacterial and yeast species can all make great bread. What matters is achieving the right balance, the right metabolic activities. Two starters with totally different microorganisms can produce similar results if their communities function in similar ways. Sourdough also has genuine health benefits compared to bread made with commercial yeast. The long fermentation time breaks down gluten proteins into smaller peptides, which makes the bread easier to digest for some people. It doesn't make sourdough safe for people with celiac disease. That's a common misconception. But for people with mild gluten sensitivity or digestive issues that aren't celiac, sourdough is often easier to handle. The lactic acid bacteria in sourdough are considered probiotics in some cases. They can potentially benefit gut health, though most of the bacteria die during baking. But some metabolites they produce survive the baking process and may still have positive effects. The organic acids, peptides, and other compounds created during fermentation can influence digestion and nutrient absorption. Sourdough has a lower glycemic index than bread made with commercial yeast. This means it causes a slower, smaller spike in blood sugar after you eat it. For people managing diabetes or trying to avoid blood sugar crashes, this is significant. The fermentation also increases the bioavailability of minerals. Grains naturally contain phytic acid, which binds to minerals like iron, zinc, magnesium, and calcium, preventing your body from absorbing them. Sourdough bacteria produce an enzyme called phytase that breaks down phytic acid. This frees up the minerals, making them available for absorption. Eating sourdough bread gives you more nutritional benefit from the same amount of grain. Traditional sourdough requires only 3 ingredients: flour. Compare that to the ingredient list on a package of industrial bread, which might have 20 or 30 items, including preservatives, emulsifiers, dough conditioners, added sugars, various oils. People who care about eating simple, minimally processed foods appreciate that sourdough is just bread reduced to its essential components. Now, let's talk about bread from around the rest of the world, because we've been focusing mostly on European and American bread, and there's so much more out there. In India, bread culture is incredibly diverse. Naan is probably the most famous internationally. It's leavened flatbread cooked in a tandoor, a cylindrical clay oven that reaches incredibly high temperatures. You slap the dough onto the inner walls of the tandoor, and it cooks in just a few minutes, developing char marks and a distinctive smoky flavor. Naan is soft and fluffy with a slightly chewy texture, often brushed with ghee or butter after cooking. Then there's roti, also called chapati, which is unleavened flat bread made from whole wheat flour called atta. You mix the flour with water and a pinch of salt, knead it until smooth, divide it into small balls, roll them thin, and cook them on a hot griddle called a tawa. The breads puff up from steam when they hit the heat, creating layers. Chapati is a daily staple for hundreds of millions of people, served with every meal. It's healthier than naan because it's whole wheat and contains no fat. Paratha is another flatbread, but it's layered and often stuffed. You roll out the dough, brush it with oil or ghee, fold it, roll it out again, repeat. This creates flaky layers. Some parathas are plain. Others are stuffed with spiced potatoes, cauliflower, paneer cheese, whatever you want. They're cooked on a griddle with ghee, getting crispy and golden. Eating fresh parathas for breakfast is one of life's pleasures. Puri is fried bread. You roll the dough thin, fry it in hot oil, and it puffs up into a balloon. Puri is crispy, light, often served with chickpea, curry, or potatoes. It's special occasion food, not everyday eating, because it's fried and rich. Across South Asia, you also find various regional breads. Kulcha in Punjab, which is leavened bread similar to naan, but baked in regular ovens. Bakri in Maharashtra, made from millet or sorghum flour. Appam in Kerala, fermented rice flour pancakes with crispy edges and soft centers. Each region has adapted bread to local grains, cooking methods, and tastes. In the Middle East and North Africa, flatbreads dominate. Pita bread is ubiquitous from Lebanon to Egypt to Turkey. It's round, slightly leavened, baked at high heat so it puffs up dramatically, creating a pocket in the center. That pocket is perfect for stuffing with falafel, shawarma, kebabs, whatever you want. Pita has been made in this region for at least 4,000 years. Ancient versions were similar, and the technique has remained basically unchanged because it works so well. Lavash is Armenian flatbread, large and thin, traditionally baked in a tonir, which is like a tandoor. You roll the dough into huge sheets, drape it over a special cushion, reach into the hot oven, and stick it to the walls. It bakes quickly, emerging thin and flexible. Lavash can be eaten fresh or dried and stored, then rehydrated later. It's perfect for wrapping around grilled meat, cheese, herbs, making quick rolls. In Iran, they have sangak, which is sourdough flatbread baked on a bed of hot stones in the oven. The stones create a distinctive, textured pattern on the bottom of the bread. In Iraq and neighboring countries, there's samoon, an oval-shaped bread with a longitudinal groove down the center. Each Middle Eastern country has its own variations, its own traditions. In Mexico and Central America, tortillas are the bread that built civilizations. Corn tortillas date back at least 12,000 years, predating wheat cultivation in the region by millennia. The process of making traditional corn tortillas, called nixtamalization, is fascinating. You soak dried corn kernels in an alkaline solution, usually water mixed with cal, which is calcium hydroxide from limestone. This chemical treatment breaks down the tough outer hull of the corn, makes the kernels easier to grind, and crucially, makes the niacin in the corn bioavailable. Without nixtamalization, populations that rely heavily on corn can develop pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency. Pre-Columbian Mesoamericans figured this out thousands of years ago through trial and error. After soaking and cooking, you wash the corn, grind it into masa, a dough with a distinctive texture and aroma. Press the masa into thin circles, cook them on a comal, a flat griddle. Fresh corn tortillas are soft, pliable, slightly chewy, with a flavor that's earthy and complex. They're served with everything, used to scoop up beans, wrap around meat, tear into pieces, and dip in salsa. Tortillas are utensils and food simultaneously. The Spanish introduced wheat to Mexico in the 1500s, and wheat tortillas became popular in northern regions where wheat grew better than corn. Flour tortillas are larger, thinner, softer than corn tortillas. They're rolled or folded around fillings to make burritos, quesadillas, and other dishes. But corn tortillas remain more traditional and are still preferred in most of Mexico. In Ethiopia and Eritrea, injera is the national bread. It's made from teff flour, which comes from tiny grain seeds native to the region. Teff is incredibly nutritious, high in protein, iron, and calcium. Injera is fermented sourdough, usually for 2 to 3 days, which gives it a distinctive sour taste. You cook it on a large flat griddle, pouring the batter in a spiral pattern covering the whole surface. It cooks into a spongy flatbread with countless tiny air bubbles on the surface. Injera serves as both plate and utensil. In traditional Ethiopian meals, you lay a large piece of injera on a platter, then pile various stews and vegetables on top. Everyone tears off pieces of injera and uses them to scoop up the food, eating with their hands. The injera soaks up the flavors of whatever it's served with, becoming part of the meal. At the end, you eat the bottom layer of injera that's absorbed all the accumulated juices and spices. Nothing goes to waste. In France, the baguette is more than bread. It's a national symbol, part of French identity. French law strictly defines what constitutes a traditional baguette. It must contain only wheat flour, water, yeast or sourdough, and salt, no preservatives, no additives, nothing else. The traditional baguette is called pain de tradition française, and bakeries that sell it must make it on site from scratch every day. The baguette's history is surprisingly unclear. Some stories claim Napoleon ordered bread to be long and thin so soldiers could carry it in special pockets sewn into their uniforms. Others say it developed in the early 1900s, when a French law prohibited bakers from working before 4 in the morning, so they needed bread that could be prepared and baked quickly. The truth is probably more mundane. The baguette shape likely evolved gradually as French bakers adopted new baking techniques and ovens in the late 1800s and early 1900s. What is clear is that August Zang, an Austrian entrepreneur, opened a bakery in Paris in the 1830s called Boulangerie Viennoise. He introduced Viennese baking techniques to France, including the use of steam ovens. Steam during baking creates a crisp, shiny crust, which became characteristic of French bread. The term viennoiserie in French, referring to pastries like croissants, comes from his influence. The word baguette literally translates to wand or stick. It wasn't officially used to describe bread until around 1920. Before that, French bread came in various shapes, but the long, thin baguette gradually became standard, especially in Paris. Today, the French consume enormous quantities of baguettes. The average French person eats about half a baguette per day. There are annual competitions for the best baguette in Paris. Hundreds of bakers compete, and judges evaluate crust color, crumb texture, taste, everything. Winning the Grand Prix de la Baguette is a huge honor. The winner gets a cash prize and, more importantly, gets to supply bread to the President of France for the next year. That's free publicity and prestige that can transform a bakery's business. In 2022, UNESCO added French baguette making and culture to its list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. This recognizes that the baguette isn't just a food product. It's a cultural practice, a social tradition, something worth preserving. The application to UNESCO emphasized how baguettes structure French daily life. People stop at the bakery every morning or evening to buy fresh bread. Bakeries are social spaces where neighbors meet and talk. The ritual of buying and eating fresh bread daily is part of what makes French culture French. Germany has an even more diverse bread culture than France. Germans eat more bread per person than almost any other country, around 200 pounds per year. German bakeries typically offer 30 to 50 different types of bread, sometimes more. There's pumpernickel, a dense dark rye bread that's steamed rather than baked, with a slightly sweet flavor and moist texture. There's Vollkornbrot, whole grain bread packed with seeds and grains. There's pretzels, which are boiled in a lye solution before baking. German bread culture has deep roots. The country has over 300 types of bread that are officially recognized, many with protected regional status. Each area has its traditional breads, recipes passed down through generations. German bakers take their craft seriously, with rigorous training and apprenticeship programs. Many Germans feel genuine pride in their bread culture and look down on the soft white bread common in other countries. The Irish have soda bread, which uses baking soda instead of yeast as a leavening agent. You mix flour, salt, baking soda, and buttermilk, shape it into a round loaf, score a cross on top, and bake it. The whole process takes about an hour from start to finish, much faster than yeasted bread. Soda bread has a dense, slightly crumbly texture and a tangy flavor from the buttermilk. It was traditionally everyday bread for Irish families, quick and simple to make with basic ingredients. In Scotland, they have bannocks and oatcakes. Bannocks are flatbreads made from oats or barley, cooked on a griddle. Oatcakes are thin, crisp crackers made from oatmeal, traditional in Scotland for centuries. Scotland's cooler, wetter climate favored oats over wheat, so oat-based breads became standard. Scandinavia has its own bread traditions. Crisp breads made from rye or barley, baked thin and hard, then stored for months. These were practical for long winters when fresh baking wasn't always possible. Swedish tunbröd, Norwegian flatbröd, Finnish näkkileipä, all variations on the theme of crisp flatbread. In China, mantou is a staple in northern regions where wheat grows well. These are steamed buns made from wheat flour, water, and yeast, steamed rather than baked. They're soft, fluffy, slightly sweet, often served with savory dishes to soak up sauces. Mantou has been around for thousands of years, mentioned in historical texts from the 3rd century. There's even a legend that they were invented by Zhuge Liang, a famous military strategist, as a substitute for human head sacrifices, though that's almost certainly myth. Japan has shokupan, milk bread that's incredibly soft and slightly sweet. Japanese bakeries developed this style in the 20th century, adapting Western bread-making techniques to Japanese tastes. Shokupan has a fine, fluffy texture. It's perfect for sandwiches or toast, and it's become a huge part of Japanese food culture even though bread wasn't traditionally eaten there. Latin America has various breads introduced by European colonizers and then adapted. Pan dulce in Mexico, sweet breads with various shapes and flavors, eaten for breakfast or as snacks. Arepas in Venezuela and Colombia, flatbreads made from ground corn, stuffed with cheese, meat, or beans. Bolillo in Mexico, crusty rolls similar to French bread, used for tortas. Mexican sandwiches. The point is, every culture that developed agriculture developed bread in some form. Grains were ground, mixed with liquid, and cooked. The specific grains, methods, and flavors differ wildly, but the basic concept is universal. Bread connects all of humanity across time and space. Now let's get into the actual science of what's happening when you make bread, because understanding the chemistry and biology makes the whole process more interesting. When you mix wheat flour and water, two main proteins in the flour, gluten and gliadin, combine to form gluten. Gluten is a network of proteins that gives dough its elasticity and strength. Without gluten, you can't make risen bread. The dough wouldn't hold together. The gas bubbles from fermentation would just escape instead of being trapped. This is why wheat is so dominant in bread making. It has high levels of gluten-forming proteins, higher than almost any other grain. Different wheat varieties have different protein contents. This high protein creates strong gluten, perfect for bread that needs to hold its structure. All-purpose flour uses a mix of hard and soft wheat, with protein around 10 to 12%. It's versatile, but doesn't create gluten as strong as bread flour. Cake flour is made from soft wheat, with protein around 7 to 9%. It creates tender, delicate baked goods, but can't support the structure needed for bread. Kneading develops the gluten. When you knead dough, you're physically aligning those protein strands, causing them to form longer chains and stronger networks. A well-kneaded dough becomes smooth, elastic, and slightly shiny. It can stretch significantly without tearing. This elasticity is crucial because when yeast starts producing carbon dioxide gas, the dough needs to expand to contain that gas while maintaining its structure. You can actually over-knead dough, though it's hard to do by hand. If you use a stand mixer on high speed for too long, the gluten network can break down and the dough becomes slack and sticky instead of elastic and smooth. But most home bakers don't need to worry about this. Kneading by hand for 10 to 15 minutes is usually perfect. Yeast is a single-celled fungus, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. When yeast metabolizes sugars in the flour, it produces carbon dioxide and ethanol through a process called fermentation. The carbon dioxide is what makes bread rise. It gets trapped in the gluten network, forming bubbles throughout the dough, making it expand. The ethanol mostly evaporates during baking, but it contributes flavor compounds before it disappears. Yeast works best at specific temperatures. Above 120 degrees, it dies. This is why bread recipes often call for warm water. You're creating optimal conditions for yeast activity. Flour contains both simple sugars that yeast can immediately consume and complex starches. Yeast can't directly eat starch, but flour also contains enzymes called amylases that break down starch into simpler sugars. As the dough sits, these enzymes work, creating more food for the yeast. This is part of why longer fermentation times can produce better bread. More time means more enzyme activity, more sugar production, more complex flavors from fermentation byproducts. In sourdough, the situation is more complex. You have both yeast and lactic acid bacteria working together. The bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid, which lower the pH of the dough. This acidic environment inhibits many other microorganisms that might contaminate the dough, but the sourdough yeast species are acid tolerant and thrive in these conditions. The bacteria also produce enzymes that break down proteins and carbohydrates in ways that commercial yeast alone doesn't. Salt plays multiple roles in bread, but it also strengthens gluten, making the dough more elastic and better able to hold gas. It controls yeast activity. Too much salt slows or stops fermentation. Too little, and the yeast works too fast, producing dough that rises quickly but develops less flavor. Most bread recipes use about 2% salt by weight of flour, which balances all these factors. Water hydration. The ratio of water to flour dramatically affects the final bread. Lower hydration, around 60% water to flour by weight, produces stiffer dough that's easier to shape and handle. The resulting bread has a tighter, more even crumb with small holes. Higher hydration, 70% or more, produces wetter, stickier dough that's harder to work with, but results in bread with an open crumb, large irregular holes, and a chewier texture. Baguettes and ciabatta use high hydration. Bagels and pretzels use low hydration. When you bake bread, the first thing that happens is oven spring. The heat causes the carbon dioxide in the dough to expand rapidly. The dough puffs up dramatically in the first few minutes of baking, sometimes increasing its volume by 50% or more. Then, the heat starts cooking the proteins. The crust forms through a combination of drying and chemical reactions. The surface of the dough dries out quickly in the hot oven, and the Maillard reaction begins. This is a chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that occurs at high temperatures. It creates hundreds of flavor compounds and gives bread its brown color and complex taste. The Maillard reaction is also what happens when you sear meat or roast coffee. It's one of the most important flavor-producing reactions in cooking. Different parts of the bread bake at different rates. The crust reaches much higher temperatures than the interior, sometimes over 400 degrees Fahrenheit, while the inside stays around 200 degrees because of moisture. This temperature difference is why the crust tastes so different from the crumb. The crust undergoes more Maillard reactions, more caramelization, more flavor development. Steam in the oven matters a lot. Professional bakers inject steam during the first minutes of baking. The steam keeps the surface of the dough moist and flexible, allowing maximum oven spring before the crust sets. It also helps create a shiny, crisp crust. Home bakers can simulate this by putting a pan of water in the oven or spritzing the dough with water before baking. Scoring, cutting slashes into the dough before baking, serves both aesthetic and practical purposes. It controls where the dough expands during oven spring. Without scoring, the dough would burst randomly at weak points. With scoring, the bread expands along the cuts in a controlled way, creating attractive patterns and allowing maximum rise. The science of bread is endlessly deep. People spend entire careers studying gluten development, fermentation, kinetics, crust formation, flavor chemistry. Every variable affects the outcome: flour type, water temperature, kneading time, fermentation duration, baking temperature, humidity, everything. This is why bread making is both simple and infinitely complex. The basics are easy. Mastering the details takes a lifetime. Now, let's talk about where bread is today and where it might be going, because we're in an interesting transitional moment. Today, bread exists in every imaginable form. You can buy factory-made white bread for $2 a loaf, soft and uniform and wrapped in plastic, designed for maximum shelf life and minimum cost. You can buy artisan sourdough for $10, made by hand by a baker who names their starter and nurtures it like a pet, fermented for 24 hours and baked in a wood-fired oven. These two products exist in the same world, often sold in the same stores, but they're completely different in every meaningful way. There's ongoing tension between industrial bread and artisan bread. Industrial bread feeds millions of people affordably. It's consistent, reliable, widely available. A single factory can produce thousands of loaves per hour, distributing them across hundreds of miles. This efficiency means even poor families can afford bread every day. That matters. That's not trivial. Food security is still a real issue in many places. But industrial bread often tastes bland, has poor nutritional value despite enrichment, and contains numerous additives that traditional bread never had. The Chorleywood process and similar methods prioritize speed and profit over flavor and quality. Critics argue this has degraded food culture, disconnected people from understanding where their food comes from, and contributed to health problems. Artisan bread, on the other hand, tastes incredible. It's made with simple ingredients, traditional methods, genuine skill. It connects people to food traditions going back thousands of years. It supports small businesses and local economies. But it's expensive. A loaf of good sourdough costs more than many people can afford regularly. If everyone switched to artisan bread, some people would have to eat less bread or go without. That's a problem. This tension isn't resolvable through simple answers. The ideal situation is probably having both options available, letting people choose based on their priorities and budgets. Home baking has seen a resurgence in recent decades. Electric bread machines became popular in the 1990s and 2000s. You dump in flour, water, yeast, salt, press buttons, and hours later you have fresh bread. These machines don't make amazing bread. They're not replicating artisan quality. But they produce bread that's fresher than store-bought, doesn't have preservatives, and smells incredible while baking. For busy families, that's valuable. The pandemic sourdough boom introduced millions of people to hands-on bread baking for the first time. Many stuck with it even after lockdowns ended and stores restocked yeast. They discovered they enjoyed the process, the meditative rhythm of kneading, the satisfaction of creating something from scratch. Baking bread becomes almost therapeutic for some people. The gluten-free market has exploded as more people are diagnosed with celiac disease or choose to avoid gluten for other reasons. Making good gluten-free bread is incredibly difficult because you're trying to create structure without the protein network that normally provides it. Early gluten-free breads were terrible, dry and crumbly and tasteless. Modern gluten-free breads are much better but still different from wheat bread. Bakers use various combinations of rice flour, corn flour, tapioca starch, potato starch, and other gluten-free flours. They add binders like xanthan gum or guar gum to mimic gluten's stretchy properties. They adjust hydration levels, add extra eggs or oil, use different leavening strategies. It's a completely different science from wheat bread baking. Some gluten-free breads are genuinely good now. The fact that people with celiac disease can buy decent bread instead of choking down cardboard is a real improvement in quality of life. But gluten-free bread is expensive because the ingredients cost more and the production is more complex. There's growing interest in ancient grains, varieties of wheat, and related species that haven't been bred for industrial agriculture. Einkorn is one of the oldest cultivated wheat species, grown by early farmers 10,000 years ago. It has lower gluten levels than modern wheat and a different gluten structure that some people find easier to digest. Emmer is another ancient wheat, slightly more glutinous than einkorn. Spelt is an ancient wheat relative that became popular in medieval Europe. Kamut is a trademarked variety of an ancient wheat species called Khorasan wheat. These ancient grains taste different from modern wheat, often nuttier and more complex. Some people claim they're healthier, though scientific evidence is mixed. They're definitely more expensive because they yield less per acre and are harder to harvest and process. But they appeal to people seeking alternatives to standard modern wheat. Health-conscious consumers are driving demand for bread with simple, recognizable ingredients. They avoid bread with high fructose corn syrup, artificial colors, preservatives they can't pronounce. This has pushed even major commercial bakeries to offer cleaner product lines with shorter ingredient lists. The farm-to-table movement has influenced bread culture too. Small bakeries are partnering with local mills and farmers. They're using wheat grown within a few hundred miles, milled fresh, baked the same day. This creates bread with incredible flavor because fresh milled flour has oils and compounds that degrade over time. It also supports local agriculture and reduces transportation emissions. There's innovation happening at the artisan level. Bakers are experimenting with different fermentation times, trying 3-day or even week-long fermentations to develop specific flavor profiles. They are reviving regional bread traditions that had nearly disappeared. They're creating fusion breads that combine techniques from different cultures, like sourdough naan or miso-flavored bread. The internet has democratized bread knowledge. You can watch videos of master bakers explaining their techniques. You can join online communities where thousands of people share tips, troubleshoot problems, post pictures of their loaves. You can order specialty flours and equipment from around the world. Knowledge that used to be closely guarded or only available through formal apprenticeship is now accessible to anyone with internet access. Bread culture varies dramatically by country. France still has strict regulations about what can be called traditional baguettes. French people still buy fresh bread daily from local bakeries. In Japan, convenience stores sell packaged sandwiches on soft white bread, a ubiquitous quick meal option. In Germany, bakeries remain central to community life. In the United States, bread culture is fragmenting, with some people buying cheap industrial bread, others seeking out artisan options, and many doing both, depending on context. Globally, Western-style bread has spread far beyond its origins. You can find sandwich bread in Asian supermarkets. Chinese bakeries make both traditional mantou and Western-style toast. African cities have bakeries selling French-style baguettes alongside local breads. This globalization brings both benefits, increased variety and choice, and drawbacks, loss of unique local traditions. Let's talk about some problems and challenges facing bread today, because it's not all positive. Bread consumption has declined in many Western countries. Americans eat less bread now than they did 50 years ago. Part of this is diet culture. Where's a bird? Time's out, time's out. Where's a bird? Time's out, time's out, time's out. Low-carb and keto diets treat bread as the enemy, something to avoid. These diets have become mainstream, and millions of people actively try to minimize their bread intake. Whether this is healthier is debatable. Some studies show benefits from reducing refined carbohydrates. Others suggest whole grains are beneficial. The science is complicated. The anti-gluten movement has also hurt bread sales. Celiac disease affects about 1% of people, and they genuinely must avoid gluten completely. But surveys show 10 to 20% of Americans are trying to reduce or eliminate gluten from their diets even without medical necessity. Some claim non-celiac gluten sensitivity, experiencing digestive problems or other symptoms from gluten. Scientific evidence for widespread non-celiac gluten sensitivity is weak, but people's experiences are real, even if the mechanism isn't fully understood. Industrial bread has an image problem. People associate factory bread with low quality, poor nutrition, lots of chemicals. There have been food documentaries and books exposing industrial food production, and bread gets caught up in this criticism. Big bakeries are trying to rebrand, offering products with simpler ingredients and cleaner labels, but changing public perception is difficult once it's entrenched. Small artisan bakeries face serious economic challenges. Rent in cities is expensive, labor costs are high, and baking requires skilled workers who deserve fair wages. Ingredients, especially high-quality flour from specialty mills, cost more than commodity flour. Equipment is expensive. Operating a wood-fired oven or maintaining sourdough starters requires more labor than using commercial yeast and modern ovens. All of this means artisan bread has to be priced high enough to cover costs and provide profit. But there's a limit to what consumers will pay. Many small bakeries operate on thin margins. A bad month or unexpected expense can threaten their survival. The pandemic killed some, though it helped others as people sought out local businesses and learned to value artisan food. The bakery business is risky and failure rates are high. Environmental impacts are getting scrutiny. Growing wheat requires land, water, fertilizer, pesticides. Industrial agriculture has damaged soil health in many regions through intensive farming. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides contaminate waterways. Monoculture wheat fields reduce biodiversity. The carbon footprint of bread varies enormously depending on farming practices, transportation distances, and production methods. Transporting wheat globally adds significant emissions. A ship carrying grain from the American Midwest to Asia emits huge amounts of carbon. Processing wheat in industrial mills uses substantial energy. Baking in large factory ovens consumes energy. Packaging creates waste, plastic wrappers that end up in landfills or oceans. Distribution. Trucks carrying bread from factories to stores adds more emissions. Some bakers are trying to reduce environmental impact. They source wheat grown using regenerative agriculture practices that rebuild soil instead of depleting it. They mill flour locally or on-site, reducing transportation. They use wood-fired ovens fueled by sustainably harvested wood or electric ovens powered by renewable energy. They minimize packaging or use compostable materials. These practices increase costs but appeal to environmentally conscious consumers. Food waste is a massive problem, and bread is one of the most wasted foods. In the UK, approximately 24 million slices of bread are thrown away every day. In the United States, 35 million loaves end up in landfills annually. People buy bread, don't eat it all, and discard it when it goes stale or moldy. That represents wasted land, water, energy, emissions, labor, everything that went into producing that bread. There are efforts to reduce bread waste. Apps like Too Good To Go connect consumers with bakeries and restaurants selling surplus food at discounts. Bakeries donate unsold bread to food banks and homeless shelters. Some people have learned to freeze bread, taking out slices as needed, extending usability. Others make breadcrumbs, croutons, or bread pudding from stale bread instead of throwing it away. But the scale of waste remains enormous. Climate change threatens wheat production directly. Wheat is sensitive to temperature and water availability. Heat waves during critical growing periods reduce yields. Droughts stress plants, lowering grain quality and quantity. Flooding damages crops. As climate becomes more unstable, wheat harvests become less predictable. Scientists are working on developing climate-resistant wheat varieties. Using traditional breeding, and genetic modification. They're creating wheat that tolerates heat better, uses water more efficiently, resists diseases that thrive in changing climates. This research is critical because bread depends on wheat, and wheat depends on relatively stable climate conditions. Labor shortages affect bakeries, especially small ones. Being a baker is hard physical work. You wake up extremely early, work long hours, stand on your feet all day, work in hot environments, do heavy lifting. The pay often isn't great compared to other jobs requiring similar hours and physical demands. Fewer young people want to become bakers. Some bakeries struggle to find workers, limiting how much they can produce. There's also the issue of knowledge transmission. Master bakers with decades of experience are retiring or passing away. Their knowledge, accumulated through years of practice, goes with them unless they teach apprentices. But formal apprenticeship programs are less common than they used to be. Some techniques and traditions are being lost because nobody documented them and the people who knew them are gone. Competition from other foods is intense. Bread used to be the default carbohydrate, the foundation of most meals. Now people have endless options. Rice, pasta, potatoes, quinoa, wraps, bagels, pizza, anything. Bread is one choice among many, and it has to compete for consumer attention. Despite all these challenges, bread isn't disappearing. People have been eating bread for 14,000 years. It's survived countless upheavals, technological changes, cultural shifts. It's going to continue. What might bread's future look like? Several trends suggest possibilities. Personalization might increase. Some experimental bakeries let customers specify exactly what they want, choosing flour types, hydration levels, fermentation times, inclusions. With advances in automation and online ordering, this could expand. Imagine ordering bread through an app, customizing every parameter, and having it baked and delivered the same day. The technology exists, it's just a question. Lab-grown or alternative ingredients are being developed. Companies are working on producing wheat proteins through fermentation, using microorganisms to make gluten without growing wheat. This could theoretically make bread production more sustainable, less dependent on agriculture, more controlled. It sounds like science fiction, but the technology is advancing. Cellular agriculture might eventually produce flour components in bioreactors. You could have factories making bread ingredients without farms. Whether people would accept this, whether it would taste the same, whether it would actually be more sustainable, all of these are open questions, but it's being researched. Alternative flours are becoming more mainstream. Cricket flour, made from ground insects, is high in protein and more sustainable than wheat. Algae flour, made from cultivated algae, is even more efficient. These sound weird to many people now, but cultural attitudes can change. In a world facing food security challenges and environmental pressures, three-dimensional printed bread exists already. It's experimental, mostly for novelty, but the technology works. You could theoretically design complex bread shapes on a computer and have them printed and baked automatically. Whether anyone wants this is unclear, but it's possible. Fermentation technology keeps advancing. Scientists are mapping the genomes of sourdough microorganisms, understanding exactly what they do. This knowledge could lead to designing custom microbial cultures for specific flavor profiles or nutritional benefits. You could have sourdough starters engineered to produce particular compounds, optimized through biotechnology. Supply chain transparency might increase through technology like blockchain. You could scan a QR code on your bread and see the exact farm where the wheat was grown, when it was harvested, where it was milled, who baked it, the complete journey from field to table. Some consumers care deeply about this information and would value complete transparency. Delivery subscriptions are growing. People sign up for regular bread deliveries, getting fresh bread weekly without having to shop for it. Algorithms learn preferences and adjust deliveries accordingly. This model combines convenience with quality, though it only works in areas with sufficient population density. Virtual baking classes have stayed popular even after the pandemic. People enjoy learning from professional bakers remotely, asking questions, getting feedback on their techniques. This could expand further with augmented reality technology. Imagine wearing AR glasses that overlay instructions and guidance as you bake, showing you in real time whether your dough is properly kneaded or your oven temperature is correct. Automated bakeries are being tested. Completely robotic bakeries with no human workers, monitored remotely and maintained periodically. They're efficient and consistent, but controversial. What happens to bakers when machines can do everything? What happens to the craft aspect of baking when it's fully automated? These are difficult questions without easy answers. Urban agriculture might change grain production. Vertical farming, hydroponics, controlled environment agriculture. These technologies are advancing rapidly. If wheat could be grown in cities, in vertical farms, near bakeries, the entire supply chain shortens. Fresher flour, lower transportation costs, reduced emissions. The technology isn't quite there yet for grain crops, which require more space than vegetables, but research continues. Climate adaptation will be necessary. As growing regions shift due to temperature changes, wheat production will move to new areas. Russia and Canada might become more important wheat producers as their northern regions warm. Traditional wheat growing areas in the United States and Europe might become less productive. This will reshape global bread economics and trade patterns. Through all of this, one thing seems certain. People will keep eating bread. The specific forms might change, the methods might evolve, the ingredients might expand. But the basic idea of grinding grain, mixing it with liquid, and cooking it into a solid food, that's too deeply embedded in human culture to disappear. Bread isn't just food. It never has been. It's history, culture, science, art, economy, politics, religion, all baked together. It's one of the most important human technologies ever developed. Without bread, cities might not have been possible. Dense urban populations need concentrated food sources and bread stores and transports better than most alternatives. Civilization as we know it might not have developed without bread. Looking back across 14,000 years, from those Natufian breadcrumbs to your sandwich today, the continuity is remarkable. The Egyptians who baked bread 4,000 years ago would recognize what we're doing. The techniques have improved, the equipment has changed, but the essence remains. Mix flour and water, add leavening, knead, let rise, bake. That formula hasn't changed. Every culture that developed agriculture developed bread independently because it's such an obvious solution to the problem of making grain edible and portable. The universality of bread across human societies shows how clever our species is at solving problems and how much we have in common despite surface differences. When you eat bread, you're participating in something ancient and ongoing. You're connected to everyone who has ever made or eaten bread throughout history. The wheat you're eating is related to the wheat that fed ancient civilizations. The yeasts and bacteria that leaven your bread are descendants of microorganisms that have been doing this for millennia. You're part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of agriculture. Bread carries meaning beyond nutrition. Breaking bread together creates bonds between people. Sharing a meal with bread is an act of trust and community. Refusing to break bread with someone is a serious rejection. These symbolic meanings are ancient and persist across cultures. The phrase, "our daily bread," appears in the Lord's Prayer, reflecting how central bread was to survival when that prayer was written 2,000 years ago. People literally depended on having bread every day. It was about basic survival. In French, copain means friend, and it literally comes from cum panis, Latin for with bread. A friend is someone you share bread with. In German, Gesellschaft means society or companionship, and it contains Saal, the room where people gather to eat together, breaking bread communally. Bread and social bonds are linguistically connected in multiple languages. The symbolism runs deeper than metaphor. Bread represents the basic necessities of life. Working to put bread on the table means providing for your family's fundamental needs. A breadwinner is the family member who earns money for food and shelter. These phrases reveal how central bread is to survival and social organization. In many religious traditions, bread is sacred. Christianity places bread at the center of communion, the most important ritual where it represents Christ's body. Judaism requires special breads for different occasions: challah for Sabbath, matzo for Passover. Islam considers wasting bread disrespectful. Bread isn't just sustenance in these traditions, it's spiritually significant, connecting people to the divine. The history of bread is inseparable from the history of humanity. When we domesticated wheat, we changed from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural societies. That shift enabled everything that came after: cities, writing, specialized labor, art, science, all of civilization. You can argue that bread made us who we are. Today, we're at an interesting moment. Industrial bread feeds billions affordably, but with questionable quality. Artisan bread revives traditions, but remains expensive and limited. Home baking connects people to their food, but requires time and skill. We have more choices than ever, but also more questions about what bread should be. The debates about bread, industrial versus artisan, white versus whole grain, modern wheat versus ancient grains, all of this reflects larger questions about how we want to live. Do we prioritize efficiency and affordability? Different people and cultures will answer differently based on their values and circumstances. What's clear is that bread matters. It has always mattered and will continue mattering. The specific forms will evolve. We might see new grains, new fermentation methods, new baking technologies. Climate change will force adaptations. Cultural preferences will shift, but people will still be grinding grain, mixing it with water, and baking it into bread thousands of years from now. The story of bread. Every baker who starts a sourdough starter, every person who learns to knead dough, every culture that maintains its traditional bread techniques, they're all writing the next chapter. The story includes massive industrial bakeries producing millions of loaves and tiny artisan operations making a few dozen. It includes ancient recipes passed down through generations and brand new innovations that nobody has tried before. If you've never made bread yourself, maybe try it sometime. Get some flour, water, yeast, salt. Mix them together. Watch it rise. This living thing growing because of tiny organisms working inside it. Bake it and smell the aroma filling your kitchen. Taste it while it's still warm. You'll be doing something humans have done for 14,000 years. You'll understand, in a direct physical way, why bread has been so important to our species. You'll connect with bakers throughout history who did the same thing, used the same techniques. Bread is remarkable. It sustained civilizations, toppled governments, inspired religions, shaped cultures. It's simple and complex, ancient and modern, universal and culturally specific. It's just flour and water and salt and time. But it's also one of humanity's greatest achievements. That's the story of bread. Every loaf ever baked, every innovation, every tradition, every cultural variation, all part of this incredible thing we've been doing since before we had cities or writing or nations. We took grass seeds and turned them by